He looked like someone's harmless grandfather. Gray hair, gentle smile, soft voice. No one would have guessed that behind those kind eyes lived one of the most horrifying killers in American history. Albert Fish wasn't the kind of monster who hid in the dark. He was the kind that knocked politely on your door. In the early 1900s, America was still innocent in many ways. Families trusted neighbors. Children played outside, and the word serial killer didn't even exist yet. But hidden in that world was a man who would soon be called the Gray Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, and the Boogeyman. He didn't just kill. He wrote letters to the parents of his victims, describing, in chilling detail, what he did to their children. The kind of letters that made even experienced detectives turn pale. Albert Fish confessed to killing and eating children, claiming that voices, sometimes even God himself, told him to do it. Yet, in person, he was calm, polite, and disturbingly normal. The kind of man who could sit beside you on a train and ask about your family while secretly imagining things too dark to repeat. This is the story of the man who became a living nightmare. The predator who didn't need to hide in shadows, because he was the shadow. And by the end of his story, you'll understand why even seasoned investigators whispered his name like a curse. Albert Fish, the real-life boogeyman. Albert Hamilton Fish was born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., into a family that already carried the heavy shadow of madness. Mental illness ran through generations like a curse. His father, Randall Fish, was 75 when Albert was born, old enough to be his great-grandfather, and his mother, Ellen, was much younger but emotionally unstable. When Albert was just 5 years old, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. With no money and no way to care for him, his mother abandoned Albert to an orphanage. And it was there, in that cold, cruel place, that the seeds of the monster began to grow. The orphanage wasn't a home. It was a place of punishment. The staff beat children with belts, paddles, and sticks for the smallest mistakes. But Jan Albert was different. He didn't just endure the pain. He began to like it. He once said that he could still remember the first time he was whipped until he bled, and the strange, confusing pleasure that came with it. Pain became comfort. Humiliation became something almost holy. By the time his mother returned to take him back at age 9, after finally finding a job in a small apartment, the damage was already done. Albert wasn't the same child she'd left behind. He was quiet, withdrawn, but with a strange glint in his eye. He began to show signs of self-harm, stabbing himself with needles, experimenting with pain as if it were a ritual. At school, he was bullied relentlessly. He had no friends. The loneliness began to twist his mind. By adolescence, he was already obsessed with stories of torture, punishment, and biblical suffering. He would later say that he often imagined God watching him, pleased when he hurt himself, as if pain brought him closer to heaven. When he was around 12, he began to visit public baths, just to watch boys undress. He started to develop fantasies about domination and control. Pain and desire became one in his mind, inseparable, fused forever. It was the beginning of a lifelong confusion between love and suffering. In his late teens, Albert began a series of behaviors that shocked even those who studied him decades later. He would cut himself, insert needles under his fingernails and into his skin, and eventually into his groin and abdomen. When doctors x-rayed his body years later, they discovered 29 needles still embedded inside him. But what made Albert Fish so chilling wasn't just his sadism. It was how he hid it. Outwardly, he seemed like an ordinary man. He worked odd jobs, painted houses, helped neighbors, and even attended church. He could charm people easily with his politeness and calm demeanor. No one suspected that behind that mild face was a man who dreamed of devouring children. As he entered adulthood, the fantasies became stronger. He started visiting male prostitutes, not for pleasure, but to test his threshold for pain, whipping, cutting, burning himself just to feel alive. He began eating raw meat, claiming it made him feel powerful, almost divine. Sometimes it was animal meat, other times it wasn't. By the time he reached his 20s, Albert Fish was a man split in two. One side, a quiet, working-class father figure, and the other, a soul entirely consumed by darkness. The orphan who once learned to find comfort in pain had now built his identity around it. And while the world saw an aging, harmless man, inside, the Boogeyman was stirring, waiting for the moment he would step out of the shadows and make his fantasies real. That moment was coming soon, and when it did, the name Albert Fish would become synonymous with evil itself. By the time Albert Fish reached his mid-20s, his mind had become a maze of fantasies too dark for anyone to imagine. He had drifted across the country, working as a painter, handyman, and janitor jobs that allowed him to blend in, to disappear among the faceless laborers of early 1900s America. He looked harmless, almost fragile, a thin man with sunken eyes and a polite smile. But behind that frail frame was a volcano of obsession ready to erupt. Fish's early crimes were not just about killing. They were about exploring his urges. He began by targeting young boys, usually from poor or neglected families. He would pretend to be a kind old man, offering them food, work, or a place to stay. His victims were the forgotten ones, the ones no one looked for too hard. And that's what made him even more dangerous. At first, his crimes were subtle acts of cruelty and sexual sadism that left his victims too afraid or ashamed to tell anyone. But soon, his fantasies turned into ritual. He carried with him a kit, a small bag containing a knife, rope, and cloth strips. He called it his implements of hell. In 1910, in Wilmington, Delaware, Fish committed one of his first known major crimes. He met a young man named Thomas Keaton and lured him to an abandoned farmhouse. What happened there over the next 2 weeks was pure horror. Fish chained the man, tortured him, and mutilated his body with knives and scissors. He later claimed he intended to kill Thomas, but stopped not out of mercy, but because the heat was unbearable and the smell too strong. Instead, he poured peroxide on the wounds, left a $10 bill for the man, and vanished. After that, something inside him snapped completely. He began to roam the streets of New York City, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia, looking for new victims. He prowled near schools, parks, and playgrounds. He would stand at the edges of crowds, watching children laugh, imagining how their innocence could be turned into suffering. Around this time, Fish began experimenting with cannibalism, starting with raw meat, then animal organs, and finally, human flesh. He claimed that the idea came to him from the Bible itself, from the story of Abraham and Isaac, where God asked a man to sacrifice his own son. Fish twisted that story into a delusion that God wanted him to save children through pain and purification. He even started writing letters, not to taunt police, but to strangers, confessing to things only he could imagine. Many of those letters were so disturbing that they were never made public. In one, he described the taste of human flesh as sweet and tender, like veal. By the 1910s and 1920s, Fish's mind was fully consumed. He no longer saw people as people, only as instruments in his religious delusion. He believed that pain, especially the pain of the innocent, could cleanse the soul, and the more he inflicted it, the closer he thought he was to God. He developed routines, rituals, even he would fast, whip himself with a belt studded with nails, then go out into the night searching for a victim. He saw every act of cruelty as a form of worship. It was during these years that his family began to notice strange behavior. His wife, Anna, often caught him pacing at night, muttering prayers under his breath, whispering about voices from heaven. He would disappear for days, then return filthy and shaking. One day, she found him sewing a paddle covered in nails. When she asked why, he smiled and said, "It's for penance." Eventually, his wife left him, taking their 6 children with her. But Fish didn't stop. In fact, her departure only fueled his descent. He saw it as a sign that God had stripped away his worldly attachments so he could complete his mission. By his 40s, Albert Fish was no longer pretending to be normal. He began visiting orphanages again, not as a child, but as a predator. He would bring candy or toys to gain trust, then disappear with whoever was unlucky enough to believe him. He once said in his confession, "I never wanted to hurt them. I just wanted to own them. Completely." But the truth was darker, because for Albert Fish, ownership meant destruction. The fantasies that started in a brutal orphanage had now become his reality. He had crossed every boundary a human being could cross, And soon, his crimes would reach a level of horror the world had never seen. And it would all begin with a little girl named Grace Budd. Albert Fish was the kind of man no one looked twice at. By the 1920s, he was already in his 50s. Frail, gray-haired, soft-spoken, and polite. He looked like someone's grandfather, the kind who might fix a broken fence or help carry groceries. To his neighbors in New York City, he was harmless, just another quiet old man trying to get by. But behind that mask of gentleness was a mind steeped in violence, obsession, and religious madness. After his wife left him, Fish sank even deeper into insanity. Yet, paradoxically, his outward life looked strangely stable. He continued to work as a painter and handyman, earning enough to pay rent and support his children when they visited. He even attended church occasionally, whispering hymns under his breath, a twisted echo of the orphanage days that had planted his obsession with sin and punishment inside his small, cluttered apartment. However, a different world existed. The walls were covered with religious icons, crosses, pictures of Christ, and verses written in shaky handwriting. But among them, Fish kept his homemade tools of redemption, whips, paddles, and a belt lined with nails. He used them not only on victims but on himself. His children, who still loved their father despite his oddities, would later recall that he sometimes walked around the house wrapped in a carpet, claiming he was doing penance. They also remembered him sticking needles into his body for atonement. Decades later, when doctors x-rayed his body after his arrest, they found at least 29 needles embedded in his pelvic region. Some rusted, some broken, all deliberately inserted by his own hand. At meals, Fish developed disturbing habits. He often refused cooked food, preferring raw meat. Sometimes he'd insist his children eat it too, saying, "It brings us closer to the blood of Christ." They thought he was eccentric, maybe even senile, not realizing they were sitting across from one of history's darkest minds. To those outside his home, Fish maintained the perfect disguise. He volunteered for odd jobs, offered to babysit neighborhood children, and spoke kindly to everyone. Parents trusted him because he seemed safe after all. What danger could an old man pose? That trust would prove deadly. He also began receiving strange letters, or rather, sending them. Fish had a habit of finding newspaper ads from lonely women or families looking for work. He'd write to them using fake names, often pretending to be a wealthy man seeking help. But his letters quickly turned obscene and violent, filled with fantasies about whipping, torture, and cannibalism. Many of these letters never reached the recipients because postmasters flagged them as indecent. Yet some did, and they terrified the people who read them. By this time, Fish's religious delusions had grown uncontrollable. He believed God was speaking directly to him, commanding him to commit acts of pain and blood. He often quoted biblical verses to justify his actions, twisting scripture into permission for murder. The sacrifice of the innocent, Aeon Sidable wrote, is pleasing in the eyes of the Lord. He saw himself as both sinner and saint, a man chosen to cleanse the world through suffering. His own pain became part of the ritual. On nights when guilt or temptation overwhelmed him, he would strip naked, whip himself with his nail-studded paddle until his back bled, then kneel in prayer, begging God for strength to finish the work. What made Fish particularly terrifying was how functional he appeared. He wasn't raving in the streets or locked away in an asylum. He was walking among families, smiling at shopkeepers, helping neighbors paint fences. He was the embodiment of hidden evil, the wolf who learned to wear the skin of a shepherd. By the late 1920s, Fish had perfected his act. He could charm almost anyone, especially children. His small stature and fatherly tone made him seem safe. He'd approach kids in parks or near grocery stores, offering candy or asking them to run errands. Most returned unharmed, but some never did. His fantasies had become unbearable. He described them as voices whispering from the clouds, telling him which child to take, when to act, and how to make it holy. He wrote later that he believed every cry, every drop of blood, was a hymn to the Lord. And so, Albert Fish, a man who looked more like a tired grandfather than a monster, continued to live among ordinary people. No one saw the signs, because he was too good at hiding. His madness was wrapped in politeness, his evil masked by prayer. But soon, His two worlds would collide. The quiet man next door would become the name whispered in every home across America. And it would start with a knock on a family's door. A knock from a man calling himself Mr. Howard. It began, as many horrors do, with kindness. In 1928, Albert Fish arrived at the Budd family home in Manhattan. He wore a neat gray suit, carried himself with the manners of a gentleman, and introduced himself as Frank Howard, a wealthy farmer looking for a young man to help with chores on his estate. He smiled warmly, spoke softly, and even brought gifts, cheese, strawberries, and the promise of honest work. The Budds, a poor but hopeful family, had no reason to suspect the frail old man sitting in their parlor was a predator in disguise. Albert's real target was Edward Budd, a strong 18-year-old boy who had placed an ad in the newspaper seeking employment. But when Fish's eyes fell on Edward's younger sister, 10-year-old Grace, something inside him changed. Later, he would claim that a voice from God whispered to him that Grace was to be taken. He told the Budds that he would hire Edward and another boy. But first, he invited Grace to accompany him to his niece's birthday party. The Budds hesitated, but Fish's age and polite demeanor made him seem trustworthy. "She'll be back by evening," he promised, tipping his hat as he led Grace away. She never returned. That afternoon, Albert Fish took Grace Budd on a trolley out of Manhattan and into Westchester County, New York. They stopped at an empty, run-down house one Fish had been renting for his darker purposes. There, in that silent, decaying building, the kind old man revealed his true nature. What happened next is one of the most disturbing acts in criminal history. Decades later, Fish would confess, in a letter sent to Grace's mother, that he had killed and eaten her child. The letter, written in his spidery handwriting, described how he lured Grace into the house, strangled her, and then cooked and ate parts of her body over the next few days. It was not just confession, it was a performance. He wrote it as if recounting a holy ritual, with no remorse, no emotion, just cold detail. "She died a virgin," he added, as if that absolved him. The letter was so horrific that even seasoned detectives who read it were physically sick, and Grace Budd was not the only one. Fish later admitted to the murders of at least 2 other children, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney and 9-year-old Frances McDonnell. Billy Gaffney disappeared in 1927 while playing with a friend in Brooklyn. The boy who survived told police the boogeyman took him. Witnesses later described seeing an old man with a gray mustache leading Billy away. When police questioned Fish years later, he recited the details with chilling precision. He said he took the boy to an abandoned house, tortured him, and later consumed parts of his body. His calmness, as he described it, left investigators stunned. Frances McDonnell's case was equally haunting. In 1924, the young boy went missing after playing outside his home on Staten Island. His body was found hanging from a tree in the woods, brutally assaulted. Witnesses again reported seeing an old man, gray, quiet, kind-looking. Fish later claimed he had been tempted by the angels that day. Each murder was ritualistic, fueled by delusion and desire. He believed he was purifying his victims, delivering them to God through suffering. His warped theology mixed punishment with pleasure, making him one of the most psychologically complex killers ever studied. He kept trophies, small bones, letters, even clippings from newspapers about missing children. His obsession with pain never left him. He alternated between inflicting it on others and himself. It was as if the two were connected, feeding the same insatiable hunger. What made Albert Fish's crime so chilling wasn't just their brutality. It was how he carried them out without chaos or rage. He was calm, methodical, and almost affectionate toward his victims before killing them. He didn't see them as people. He saw them as sacrifices, tiny offerings to a God only he could understand. The police at the time had little to go on. For years, the murders remained unsolved, each one written off as a random act of cruelty. No one connected the quiet, polite house painter to the disappearances of children. He blended into the background too well. Even when people described the gray man lurking near crime scenes, police dismissed it as rumor. After all, who would suspect an elderly man who looked like someone's kindly uncle? Albert Fish used society's own assumptions as his weapon. His appearance, his politeness, even his age, all were tools to disarm suspicion. and it worked again and again. By the late 1920s, he had perfected his pattern. He would wander through neighborhoods, find families in need, and offer false kindness. He would write letters to lure them in, using religion, money, or charity as bait. Every word, every act, was part of his deception, but it was his need to communicate, to confess, that would eventually undo him. His arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable, pushed him to send one letter to many. That letter, addressed to Grace Budd's mother, would finally expose the man behind the mask. And when investigators traced its origin, the world would come face to face with the monster that parents had warned their children about 4 generations. The real Boogeyman. Boogeyman. Albert Fish wasn't a man who simply killed. He was a man who believed his murders meant something. Every act of cruelty, every moment of torture, every scream, he saw it all as divine instruction. His crimes weren't random, they were ritual. They followed a pattern that blurred the lines between madness, faith, and evil itself. To understand Albert Fish, you have to enter the mind of a man who saw pain as purity. He claimed that God spoke to him through visions and voices, commanding him to harm children to save them from sin. In his twisted worldview, he wasn't committing evil. He was carrying out sacred punishment. Fish was obsessed with suffering. From childhood, pain became his teacher, his comfort, and later, his faith. The beatings in the orphanage had rewired him. What terrified most children gave him pleasure, and by adulthood, pain and pleasure had become inseparable in his mind. He would stab himself with needles, whip himself with belts, and even drive nails into his body as acts of atonement. He believed these rituals cleansed his soul. When police later x-rayed his body, they found over 29 needles embedded deep in his pelvic region, some rusted from years of being there. He had lived every day with pain he had inflicted on himself. To him, suffering wasn't punishment, it was prayer. Fish's understanding of religion twisted scripture into justification. He quoted Bible verses about sacrifice and purity, claiming he was redeeming children by freeing them from the corruption of the world. He spoke of sinful desires, of purity through pain, and of hearing God's voice in his head, commanding each act. It wasn't insanity in the traditional sense, it was a controlled delusion. Psychiatrists who later studied him described it as religious mania combined with sexual sadism. He derived physical satisfaction from inflicting agony, but he cloaked that lust in divine language. When questioned, he never showed anger or remorse, only calm conviction. "I was chosen," he would say softly, "chosen to do his work." Every murder followed this formula: temptation, purification, consumption. He believed by consuming his victims, he was absorbing their purity, cleansing their souls through his own suffering. The act of cannibalism wasn't just about hunger, it was about holiness. Fish's delusions were fueled by guilt and self. He saw the world as evil, himself as a sinner, and his crimes as penance. His diary entries later found by police were filled with prayers mixed with horrific fantasies. One passage read, "I will atone through the pain of others, for my own cannot be enough." This belief system made him unpredictable and unstoppable. Unlike killers who sought fame, money, or revenge, Fish's motive came from inside a personal religion with no moral compass. You couldn't reason with him because his crimes weren't logical. They were sacred. Experts struggled to define him. Some called him a psychopath, others a schizophrenic, but no single label captured the full horror of his mind. Fish wasn't delusional all the time. He could function, work, raise children, hold polite conversations. His madness was selective, waiting behind the mask of normalcy until it was time to emerge. In many ways, Albert Fish was a mirror of human contradiction. He was gentle and monstrous, calm and violent, devout and depraved. His face looked like that of a kindly grandfather, yet his thoughts were darker than anything fiction could invent. What terrified investigators most wasn't his brutality, it was his peace. He believed with every fiber of his being that what he did was righteous. When describing his crimes, he often smiled, as though recounting a prayer answered. Fish's brain became a battlefield where faith fought madness, and madness won. His acts weren't driven by impulse, but by ritual, rehearsed and planned like a ceremony. Before each killing, he prayed. Afterward, he prayed again. His victims weren't murdered in rage, they were sacrificed. When psychiatrists examined him after his arrest, they found a man fully consumed by his delusions. He spoke of angels and demons, of voices guiding his hand, of divine pain. Yet he also spoke coherently, politely, and even humorously at times. That combination of functioning mind serving a broken soul made him one of the most disturbing psychological cases in criminal history. In the end, Albert Fish wasn't just a killer. He was a belief system gone wrong, a perfect storm of religious obsession, sexual perversion, and psychological trauma. His story is a reminder that sometimes evil doesn't come from rage or greed, but from conviction when someone truly believes that their darkness is holy light. Albert Fish didn't think he was a monster. He thought he was a servant of God. And that's what made him one of the most terrifying men who ever lived. For years, Albert Fish moved like a ghost through America's cities, unnoticed, unsuspected, untouchable. His victims were poor, forgotten, invisible. No one connected the disappearances. No one imagined that behind the polite smile of an old man lived the true face of horror. But in 1934, that mask finally cracked because of a single, sickening letter. It all began with Grace Budd, the 10-year-old girl whose disappearance haunted New York City for 6 years. In June 1928, Fish had visited the Budd family under the false name Frank Howard, pretending to offer their teenage son a job at his farm. He charmed them, easily soft-spoken, gentlemanly, the kind of man any mother would trust. But instead of hiring Edward, he turned to little Grace and said, "Would you like to come to my niece's birthday party?" Her parents, seeing no harm, agreed. Grace never came back. For years, there were no answers, just silence and grief. Detectives hit dead ends. The Budd family clung to the hope that maybe she was alive somewhere. Then, in November 1934, Mrs. Budd received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter, several pages long. At first, it seemed like a confession, but what it contained was beyond anything the human mind should ever read. The letter began with a disturbing story of cannibalism. Fish claimed to have committed years before eating a boy in China during a famine tenet. He wrote about Grace, explaining in chilling detail how he lured her, killed her, and ate her flesh. He described how she died a virgin, and that it gave me pleasure to know that. Every word was deliberate, written in the calm tone of a man describing dinner. Imagine being a mother opening that letter, reading, line by line, how your daughter's last moments were turned into a ritual. The police said Mrs. Budd fainted before she could finish it. When she came to, she handed it to detectives, her hands shaking. That letter would become one of the most infamous documents in criminal history. Not only for what it described, but because it finally led them to the killer. The letter was written on stationery paper that investigators traced back to the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. It was a small clue, but the key they needed. Detectives learned that the paper had been stolen by a man who rented a room at a boarding house on East 52nd Street. His name was Albert Fish. They waited. Days passed before Fish returned to check his mail. When he finally walked in, detectives were ready. They approached him calmly, told him they had a few questions. Fish nodded politely, smiling as if they'd stopped him for directions. But when one officer mentioned the Budd letter, Fish's demeanor changed. His eyes went distant, almost peaceful. Then he said, "I knew you'd come for me eventually." When they searched his pockets, they found a small knife and a bundle of handmade tools, scissors, needles, and a meat cleaver sharpened to perfection. When asked what they were for, he replied softly, "For my work." Detectives arrested him on the spot. For the first time, the Boogeyman had a face. And it wasn't a monster hiding in the dark. It was an old man with white hair and gentle eyes, standing quietly as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. At the police station, he didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply sat down and said, "I have things to tell you, terrible things." And then he began to talk calmly, clearly, as if confessing sins at church. The letter that started it all became Exhibit A in one of the most chilling cases in American history. Investigators and reporters struggled to comprehend how anyone could describe such acts with that much composure. One detective later said, "It wasn't his words that haunted me. It was how gentle his voice was while saying them." Albert Fish's capture was just the end of a manhunt. It was the unmasking of evil that had walked unnoticed among normal people for decades. The letter meant for one grieving mother had instead exposed the boogeyman himself, and as police led him away in handcuffs, reporters outside shouted his name, trying to get a look at the monster they'd all heard about. But Fish didn't look monstrous. He looked small, tired, almost pitiful, and that was the scariest part of all. Realizing that evil doesn't tell boys roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. That day, Albert Fish's reign of horror finally ended. But what he revealed in the days after would be even darker than the crimes themselves. Because when he began to confess, the world realized Gracebud was only one of many. When Albert Fish was brought into custody, no one truly understood the depth of what they were about to uncover. Detectives thought they were dealing with the abductor and murderer of one little girl, Gracebud. But as soon as Fish began to speak calmly and politely, they realized they were sitting across from something far more terrifying. A man who had spent decades feeding his own delusions, crafting rituals of pain and death, all under the belief that he was doing God's work. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was thick. The air felt heavy, not from shouting or violence, but from the sheer unease of how ordinary he seemed. One officer later said, "He didn't talk like a killer. He talked like a priest, explaining his faith." When detectives asked him about Gracebud, Fish didn't hesitate. He described every moment, from how he met her family to the day he took her away. His tone was soft, almost grandfatherly, as he explained how he couldn't help himself. He told them about the voices, how God whispered commands in his ear, telling him to purify children through suffering. And the detective's men who had seen countless murders sat frozen, unable to speak. He didn't just confess to one crime. He confessed to many. He told them about Francis McDonnell, the 9-year-old boy he strung-led with suspenders after luring him into the woods. He spoke about Billy Gaffney, the 4-year-old he kidnapped from a Brooklyn apartment building. And then, in words that made even hardened investigators sick, described how he tortured and cooked parts of the boy's body. Every time they asked why, Fish gave the same calm answer. "God told me to. I was chosen to do his will." His confessions were methodical, like a man reciting a routine. He never cried, never raised his voice. When shown photos of the victims, he didn't flinch. In fact, at times, he smiled faintly, as though lost in a memory that gave him peace. One psychiatrist later said, "He was the most complete case of religious psychosis I have ever encountered." He believed that pain was divine. Detectives found his apartment full of evidence letters, newspaper clippings about missing children, and drawings that made their stomachs turn. But the most disturbing discovery came when they x-rayed his body. They found over 29 needles lodged deep in his pelvic region. Needles he had inserted himself over the years as part of his twisted form of penance. When asked why he did it, he said, "To feel closer to God." Fish's calmness disturbed everyone who came near him. Even the prison guards, used to handling murderers, said they could never fully look him in the eye. He was polite, cooperative, even cheerful, offering to help clean, or asking about their families. But beneath that politeness was something hollow, something that made your skin crawl just by being in the same room. He told investigators he'd never felt guilt. "I only did what I was told," he said. "Pain is good. Pain brings you closer to salvation." It was this complete detachment from reality that led psychiatrists to debate whether he was insane or purely evil. Some said his delusions were genuine, that he truly believed he was on a holy mission. Others argued that Fish knew exactly what he was doing and used religion as an excuse to satisfy his sadistic desires. But the most haunting part of his confession came not from his words, but from how at peace he seemed while saying them. Detectives described the silence that followed each statement. No remorse, no fear, just calm acceptance, like a man confessing a sin he thought had already been forgiven. When reporters asked one of the lead detectives what it was like to talk to Albert Fish, he said quietly, "It's like staring into a bottomless pit. You keep waiting to see something human, and there's nothing there." Even the psychiatrists who examined him couldn't agree on what to call him. Sadist, cannibal, religious maniac. But the truth was simpler and more horrifying. Albert Fish was a man who turned faith into madness, pain into worship, and murder into prayer. His confessions filled over 50 pages of reports. Each one was worse than the last, and through it all, he never once raised his voice, never once begged for forgiveness. Instead, he ended every statement with a quiet, almost serene phrase, "God knows my heart." By the end of his interrogation, detectives were drained, shaken, and sleepless. They had caught the boogeyman, but what haunted them most wasn't he just what he'd done. It was realizing how easily he had hidden among them, blending into normal life while carrying horrors no one could imagine. And as they closed his case files, one thought lingered in every mind. Evil doesn't always rage. Sometimes it just whispers and waits for someone to listen. The trial of Albert Fish in 1935 wasn't just another courtroom drama. It was a national nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Reporters, psychologists, and horrified families filled the benches, staring at the frail, gray-haired man sitting quietly at the defendant's table. He looked more like a grandfather than a murderer, polite, calm, with hands folded neatly. But behind that calmness was a history of unspeakable crimes that the world was struggling to believe could come from one human being. The prosecution called him the most vicious criminal in American history. The defense called him insane beyond comprehension. But the question at the heart of the trial was simple. Was Albert Fish a man who knew right from wrong, or a lunatic lost in his own twisted version of God's will? Throughout the trial, Fish remained disturbingly composed. He rarely showed emotion, even as witnesses described the horrors of what he had done. When the letter to Grace Spud's mother was read aloud, the same letter where he described killing and eating her daughter, several people fainted. Some left the courtroom in tears. Fish sat motionless, eyes half closed, as if meditating. His defense attorney, James Dempsey, argued passionately that Fish was insane. He brought psychiatrists who testified that Fish suffered from religious psychosis, that his sense of morality was warped by delusions of divine command. Dempsey's closing argument still chills historians to this day. He is insane, and he is beyond any help this world can give. To execute him would be like putting a child to death for killing ants. He does not understand what he has done. But the prosecution wasn't moved. They showed evidence of his careful planning. The letters, the travel, the tools, proving he knew what he was doing.
"This man is not mad," the prosecutor said.
"He is evil." For every psychiatrist who called him insane, another said he was cunning, manipulative, and fully aware of his actions. The jury sat stunned, caught between horror and disbelief. Could someone so frail, so calm, truly be the monster from the newspapers? The gray man, the boogeyman of children's nightmares. Even Fish's children were brought to testify. They told stories of his strange punishments, his obsession with pain, his ramblings about God and purity. Some wept, while others refused to look at him. But Albert himself never once showed remorse. He spoke only when asked direct questions, often smiling faintly or whispering short, polite answers. When asked if he had any final words before sentencing, A sighed softly. "I have nothing to say except that I leave it all to God." On March 21st, 1935, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. They found Albert Fish sane and fully responsible for his crimes. The sentence, death by electric chair. As the words were read, Fish simply nodded. There was no outburst, no plea, only calm acceptance. In the months leading up to his execution, Fish lived in solitary confinement at Sing Sing prison. Guards described him as quiet and polite. He read the Bible daily, prayed often, and sometimes hummed to himself. One guard later said, "It was hard to believe the things he'd had done when you saw how gentle he looked behind those bars." On January 16th, 1936, Albert Fish walked to the electric chair. He needed no assistants, dressed neatly, hair combed. He even thanked the guards for treating him kindly. As he said Dune, he reportedly smiled and said, "It will be the supreme thrill, the only one I haven't tried." Those were his final words. When the switch was pulled, his body jerked violently and then went still. He was pronounced dead minutes later. The needles in his pelvis caused a small electrical malfunction, but the execution succeeded. The man who had worshipped pain had finally met it in its most final form. After his death, the public sighed in relief, but the horror lingered. His case became one of the most studied in criminal psychology. Some called him proof that pure evil exists. Others said he was a victim of untreated madness. His name was whispered in fear for decades. The man who prayed, smiled, and killed. And though Albert Fish was gone, what he represented stayed the idea that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear kind faces, speak softly, and blend in perfectly with the world around them. The trial and execution of Albert Fish closed one of the darkest chapters in American history. Yet even as the lights dimmed in Sing Sing that night, one truth remained unshakable. You can kill the man, but you can never erase the shadow he leaves behind. When the electric chair at Sing Sing went silent, Albert Fish's body was gone, but his shadow didn't fade. It lingered, spreading through American culture, psychology, and even pop horror for generations. He wasn't remembered like Bundy, charismatic and manipulative, or Dahmer, tragic and lonely. Fish stood apart as something more ancient, almost mythic, the embodiment of pure, religiously justified evil. To this day, psychologists still struggle to define what Albert Fish truly was. Was he insane? Or was he one of the few humans to consciously embrace evil as a form of worship? His case became a cornerstone in forensic psychology, studied in universities and criminal profiling courses around the world. Experts said Fish was a sexual psychopath with religious delusions. Others went deeper, arguing he was a man who merged pain, punishment, and pleasure until they were inseparable, believing he was saving his victims' souls by destroying them. After his execution, police unearthed more evidence, scraps of letters, strange sketches, and testimonies from families of missing children. It's believed he may have killed as many as a dozen victims, though only 3 were ever confirmed. Every time new evidence surfaced, it added another layer to his darkness, proving that what people knew of him was only a fraction of what he'd done. But Fish's story wasn't just about crime. It was about how society completely failed to see him. He lived among people for decades. A husband, a father of 6, a house painter who smiled and greeted neighbors. His neighbors called him sweet. His landlady thought he was harmless. Even his children, who later learned the truth, said they never imagined their father capable of such acts. That duality, kindness, hiding cruelty, became the most haunting part of his legacy. Movies, books, and documentaries often soften his story, but the truth is far worse than fiction. He inspired countless horror characters: the quiet killer who prays, the old man who lures children, the monster who believes he's righteous. But what makes Albert Fish more terrifying than any movie villain is that he was real. Forensic experts studying his brain found no physical abnormality, no tumor, no damage, nothing that could explain his madness. That discovery unsettled the public even more. If his evil didn't come from a defect, then it came from choice. It meant that somewhere in him there was awareness, a decision to hurt, to torture, to devour. His story also exposed the cracks in early 20th century law enforcement. Police at the time had little coordination between states, poor communication, and limited forensic ability. Had Fish lived even a few decades later, he likely would have been caught far earlier. But biked, 10 killers like him could move freely, their pasts erased by distance and time. Albert Fish's gaze forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth. Monsters don't just hide in alleys. They hide in plain sight. In neighbors, family men, even churchgoers. He became a symbol of how evil adapts, how it wears masks of decency to walk among the innocent. To this day, his letters are locked in archives, too disturbing to read aloud in full. Investigators who've handled them describe an aura of dread, as if the words themselves carry something One criminologist said, "You don't read fish, you survive him." And maybe that's why, a century later, his name still carries weight. Albert Fish isn't just a case file. He's a warning. A reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with screams or violence. Sometimes it knocks politely at your door, smiling, holding a bag of tools, asking to come in. In the end, Fish's life and death blur the line between madness and monstrosity. He wasn't possessed by demons. He created his own, and he worshipped them until the day he died. If Jeffrey Dahmer showed us how loneliness can become lethal, Albert Fish showed us how faith, twisted by obsession, can justify anything. Albert Fish wasn't a monster from nightmares. He was the nightmare, the living proof that the scariest evil doesn't hide in darkness. It walks in daylight, prays before it kills, and smiles while it damns itself. If you thought Dahmer or Bundy were horrifying, you haven't met the Gray Man. Subscribe for more stories that uncover the darkest truths about humanity. Because sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones who look just like us.